Good morning, everyone. Tony Brake, this is not your profession, your professional career to monitor Osprey in San Francisco Bay, but you and Harv Wilson approached Alan Fish at Golden Gate Raptor Observatory, 8-9 years ago now?
2012.
Yeah. And said, hey, we think there's something interesting going on with Osprey in San Francisco Bay. I'll let you tell about it. And then you came up, you and Harv, and approached me at the Mare Island Preserve only because you were looking for access to getting to look at Osprey nests on the Mare Island area. And I think it wasn't but a few weeks later we founded together the first San Francisco Bay Osprey Festival, or Osprey Days. So together, and we've been fast friends and great partners, and I've learned much more from you than you from me, Tony. So just welcome and thank you so much for being on today.
I want to thank Myrna for somehow putting together this Osprey Days with all of these obstacles, you know, the sort of natural one that we've all been dealing with, and then the unnatural, uncalled for obstacles that have been placed in the way. But anyway, I'm going to start the talk here. I'm going to share the screen, and this will hopefully pop up. Yeah, so this is the what I'm going to be talking about is this expanding osprey nesting population on San Francisco Bay. And you know, if you just sort of come in the last few years, you think, well, osprey are really common on San Francisco Bay, but in fact, this is a very very recent phenomenon. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But first, I want to mention some of the biology of ospreys. It's a very unique species of bird. So it's a rather large raptor. It's larger than a red-tailed hawk, which is probably the one you most often see around here. It's in between, say, a red-tailed hawk and a bald eagle in size. The length is about 25 inches, more or less. Wingspan averages 63 inches, and they may weigh about 3.5 to 4 pounds. The females are larger than the males, so some of the females weigh as much as 4 pounds or a little bit more. The diet is almost exclusively live fish. I mean, at least 99.9%. I've never seen osprey predate on anything other than fish. There are a few scattered reports, but that's probably where there's very poor fishing possibility. They're very highly specialized in order to catch these fish. So they have a specialized wing anatomy that allows them to just, after diving into the water, to just take off out of the water, which other raptors would have to paddle to shore to get out of the water. They have this reversible outer toe that allows them to better grab the slippery fish. And then they also, for that purpose, they have these spicules on the legs and feet. I'll show some of that. They have especially long curved talons, and they have closable nares or nostrils that they can close as they dive into the water. And they're very cosmopolitan. Ospreys breed or winter on every continent except Antarctica. There's only a couple other species, a peregrine falcon, and actually I can't remember what the other one is now, that's true for. They've been an excellent sentinel species for aquatic habitats. During the DDT era, they were actually the first species to because they're so conspicuous, people in the Atlantic coast and noticed them, this rapid decline. And then once the widespread use of DDT was banned, there was a very remarkable recovery following that ban. So the species have now climbed back up to their historical levels and maybe even beyond. And then because they're so conspicuous and vocal, and their nests are usually very visible, they provide a great opportunity to engage the public in observation of raptor breeding behavior, which is not really very common possibility. Most raptors are much more secretive, and their nests are not very visible without disturbing them. So here's an example, the fleshy closable nostrils that presumably close as they dive into the water, and I'll show you, that's quite a explosive dive in there. So they would be, a lot of water would be forced in there. And then here's a close-up of the feet of one of the nestlings after it was just banded. So he has these spicules on the legs and the feet that better grip the fish. And then here's the reversible outer toe, so it can be either on the front or in the back. And usually when they grab the fish, they have two on each side. So here's a video. This was originally on an old BBC show, showing the amazing fishing skills of Osprey. So it's a little short video clip. And this is what this is the usual technique that we see around here. So it's pretty hard to imagine how they can spot that fish from 50 or 100 feet up and then make their dive quickly enough to catch it, but they just do this routinely. And that's sort of commonly they have to shake the water out. And here's with some schooling fish. So I think there were at least 5 fish got at one time there, but we actually have had a couple cases where the Osprey at our nest, the local nest cam that I'll talk about later, brought in 2 fish with one delivery. So here's shows the range map of Osprey. So the orange is the breeding areas, and the blue is the wintering areas. So they're breed throughout the northern hemisphere, and then winter usually in the tropical areas or some further south. There are a few non-migratory populations closer to the tropical areas, so around Baja California and Gulf of California, Florida, in the Middle East and Australasia. There's a non-migratory population. So zooming into our area, so here's the North American range map. So again, the orange is the breeding area. The purple is a year-round, so it's breeding and wintering. You see we're kind of right at this boundary of the wintering and breeding areas. This is a little bit out of date at this point as far as the west coast. There are some populations forming down in coastal Orange County and San Diego County. And then during the winter, we have some fraction of at least the males on established nests over winter. But most of the birds will migrate south, possibly to southern Mexico and Central America. And on the East Coast, they go further south into South America most of the time. So when Harv and I started this effort to document the expanding population, this is kind of what the history was of ospreys on the San Francisco Bay. So a number of years back, Jack Broughton at the University of Utah did a very careful analysis of the remains that were found in the Emeryville Shell Mound when it was excavated at the early 20th century. And unfortunately, it was missing the last 700 years because that had already been removed for a dance hall. But anyway, he found no evidence of any osprey remains. In fact, there were a lot of other raptors, and in other places where osprey have known to be present for a long time, they're found in those areas. So that was a little bit of a surprise that they, at least at that far back, that the ospreys were not likely populating San Francisco Bay. Then there's sort of a gap in the record. Then there's late 18th and early 19th century. During Grinnell's landmark studies on wildlife in California, he reported that they were formerly widespread over the whole length of California, but rare in the Bay Area. In fact, he stated that the nearest nests were on the Russian River in Sonoma County. In the mid-1960s, a colony was founded at Kent Lake on the flanks of Mount Tamalpais. And Jules Evans has been studying this population since the 1980s. And by 1994, this colony had grown to 52 occupied nests, but then subsequently it has declined. I think there are about 20 or so nests the last few years. So then on San Francisco Bay proper, Robin Leong and some others found the first nest on the San Francisco Bay tidelands. It was at Mare Island on a pile driver. Over the next, and then there were a couple, there was at least one nest by Point Panola in 1998, and then there was maybe reported breeding pair in further south in the East Bay, but for the most part, only one or two nests for quite a long time. And then starting in 2003, the population of Mare Island started to rapidly grow to almost over 10 years to about the size that it is now. So that's sort of where Harv and I came into the picture. But we had been noticing that we were seeing a lot of osprey during the summer. And if you read the species accounts for osprey, you would read that they were an uncommon migrant or winter visitor. But this is clearly not the case anymore. So we kind of set out to try to document this expanding population. And as Myrna said, we approached Alan Fish at Golden Gate Raptor Observatory. So from 2013, it was sort of done under the auspices of the Golden Gate Raptor Observatory. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. So between 2012 and 2020, the population has expanded both in size and extent. So what we found in 2013, see if I can show. So these yellow icons with the dark centers, those are active nests in San Francisco Bay. So you can see this cluster had already developed along the Mare Island Strait, and there were a few nests along the Richmond shoreline, and then one in Alameda and one in San Francisco. And then this current season, the number of active nests you can see has grown tremendously. So there's still this cluster up here, and look along the Richmond shoreline. There were 21 active nests along the Richmond shoreline in 2020, and they're also now starting to be occupied over on the Marin side of the bay. This is the Point San Pablo, Point San Pedro. That's the narrowest part of San Francisco Bay. There is also a cluster down in Oakland, Alameda, and there's still only one in San Francisco. And then there are two I've actually cut off one of them. There's one in Foster City and one in Menlo Park. So they've starting to reach the very bottom of the bay. So it'll be interesting to see if some of these gaps get filled up eventually. This is sort of a quantitative display of that growth. So the yellow line follows the growth in the number of fledglings each year. So you can see there's been this steady growth until last year. There was a big, very bad year last year, a lot of nest failures. And I think this was probably due to the strong May storms, which occurred at a very vulnerable time at many of the nests where they had very young nestlings or the eggs were just ready to hatch. But it's been sort of a bounce back year this year. And this is sort of estimated. I don't know the exact numbers now, but given that most of these nests have young that are fairly advanced, they're very likely to eventually fledge. So we're actually sort of pushing up towards 100 fledglings. And then if you look at the blue bars, those are the successful nests, meaning they fledged at least one young. And then the orange is active nests that didn't fledge young, but incubation had started. So you can see there's been a steady growth in both of those cases. So the number of successful nests has continued to grow, except for, as I said, last year, which was sort of an anomaly. And the total number of nests, just the sum of the successful and active nests, has continued this steady growth. And this is so when you're looking at raptor populations, the productivity gives you some idea of whether it might be a stable population, growing population, or maybe a declining population. And the most important number that's usually looked at is the number of young produced per active nest. So the number of fledglings that come from nests that where incubation has started. eggs have been laid and incubation started. So this number around it varies from species to species depending on a number of variables, the annual survival and so forth, and the number per nest to give a stable population or growing population. Anyway, that for ospreys, it's considered to be about one fledgling per active nest would give you a stable population. So you can see on this red line, this is the number for the San Francisco Bay osprey population. It's well above that number, which is maybe what you expect for a growing population, except for this, even last year, which was the worst year during this whole time that we've been monitoring, is still within the range of a stable population. And just this is another indication of how productive the nests are. So this is the number. So this is between 2012 and 2019, which amounts to 195 successful nests and 420 fledglings. That sort of shows the size of all the broods. So these 37 had one fledgling per nest, 93 had two per nest, and 64 were three successfully fledged. So you can see that the numbers of these are predominantly are 2 or 3 young per nest, and we've even had actually now we've had 2 nests that have produced 4 young, which is really quite unusual. So here, fortunately, we came in at kind of things that already started taking off, but fortunately, Robin Leong and Wally Neville have been monitoring ospreys and other avian species at Mare Island Strait since the 1980s. So they had a data that went back prior to when we started doing these surveys. So this is sort of what the number of nests along the Mare Island Strait each year from this. So as I said, the first nest was in 1990, but then for a long time there was only possibly one nest per year. And then it started increasing to multiples beginning in 2003. So you can see it's sort of, again, a pretty steady increase. And it may be sort of plateauing at this point. So, which is kind of not unusual. This actually looks very much like what happened in Scotland when they had the recovery from what had been a complete extirpation of nesting osprey. Sort of a long lag and then a climb and then a sort of a plateau. And this, when it really took off here, actually sort of coincides with at Kent Lake. There was in 2008, a bald eagle pair started nesting there, and a lot of the osprey nests in the vicinity of this bald eagle nest became inactive. And there actually were, I think that led to probably some increased nesting along the Inverness Ridge, but maybe some of the osprey did move over to San Francisco Bay. In fact, at Kent Lake, there are no fish that are really accessible to osprey, so they have to commute to get their fish. They would go all the way to Tomales Bay, Bolinas, and San Francisco Bay to get their fish. So maybe some of them had, recognized that once they could find a nest site, that it was much more efficient to fish around, to nest around San Francisco Bay and have much shorter flights for foraging. This is just for the last 9 years at Mare Island or Vallejo. This is the Vallejo nest. So it sort of looks like it's sort of now in this point where it's sort of saturated and is sort of fluctuating up and down. This is probably right at the end of the growth, and now we're getting a fairly constant number. We'll see how that pans out in the future. Historically, osprey built their nests on natural structures, which include live trees, snags, broken off tops. This is Yellowstone. This is a Mono Lake. They nest on the tufa towers, even though there are no fish in Mono Lake, but they will commute to the mountain streams and lakes in the area. But it kind of demonstrates how important a secure nest site is for osprey. That's like probably the most limiting, given that there's a good fish population nearby. Obtaining a secure nest site is really the limiting factor for osprey nesting. This is so in Baja California and on the mainland along the Gulf of California, there's a non-migratory osprey population, and you can see how versatile they are. So they're using the cactus here to build a nest, and you can imagine it's been quite a few years in use, given how many sticks have accumulated. This is one of the most amazing ones. This is in on one of these small islands in the Persian Gulf near Abu Dhabi, and so on predator-free islands, the osprey will nest on the ground or on rock outcrops and so forth. So this nest must be many decades in use, I presume. In contrast, well, this is the only osprey nest in San Francisco Bay that is on a tree. This is on the Mare Island Preserve. And this is I think this was in 2012, maybe 2013. It was still alive, but it's a now dead tree without all these fronds, but it's still active nest. All the other nests are on human-made structures. So, for example, there are a number of cranes at Mare Island and also here in Richmond on cranes that are non-operational. That provides a nice, high, secure site. And then these tall light structures turn out to be very good nest structure. This is one on the Coast Guard Pier off of the preserve, and this is sort of an interesting history because this was originally a great blue heron nest, or actually they would have 3 nests on the structure, and then I can't remember what year, a few years before we started doing our surveys, the ospreys managed to take over this nest. And then in 2014, the great blue herons must have got set up early enough that they were able to resecure this as a nest structure, and the ospreys had to move, actually ended up on the roof of the Coast Guard building. And then last year, I was surprised to see that they now had sort of come to some sort of compromise. So now you can see on the top nest, there's the osprey nesting. And then each of the lower 2 structures, there's a great blue heron nest there, and there's one standing there. So the last 2 years, this is how this structure has been used. There have been a lot of recently, marine structures, channel markers, other aids to navigation, and dolphins offshore. So this is a nest that's on a channel marker in San Pablo Bay on Pinole Shoal. It actually has a foghorn on there that sounds every 10 seconds. And I'm not sure, the first year I know they weren't able to turn it off because the nest was already active. And so these ospreys managed to somehow tolerate that huge sound there. And it just sort of goes to show you how important a secure nest site is. In Chesapeake Bay, which has as many as 10,000 osprey pairs, including all the tributaries, over half of the channel markers actually have osprey nests on them. So this will probably become a more frequent nest site. And this is the one I was mentioning to Myrna. There's a nest at Point Pinole. If you go out on the fishing, about halfway out on the fishing pier, and look to the east or the northeast, there's a remnants of an old pier that was there previously, and there's been a nest, successful nest there since 2017. This is the nest. This is actually the first one sort of got me involved in this, because we can actually see this nest from our front window. We moved to Point Richmond in 2011, and so we first noticed this nest. They weren't successful that year, but the next year they were successful, and that's kind of got me going in on my attracted my interest to this this development. That also turned out Harv had been following a nest in Alameda that had sort of recently become active. So let's see, there's a couple others. So they often will nest on power poles, distribution poles, and of course this can be a problem, which I'll mention in a little bit. But this is at Point Melody in Richmond. This was active from 2009 to 2013, and also going to come back to that one. So this is in Foster City. This nest has been active for a couple of years. So here's a large, transmission tower. It's actually a line of these, probably, I don't know, a couple hundred maybe, so maybe potential sites. So right there is a osprey nest, and then here's a close-up. So this is actually a pretty good site. You know, it's nowhere near the wires, so forth. So these ones that have these struts across them down lower can produce a pretty good nest substrate. So all this growth of the ospreys around the bay has actually attracted a lot of interest. I sort of really got started when Myrna somehow managed to throw together this first Osprey days in 2013. You know, she had sort of mentioned it to Harvard me, but it was, I can't remember, it must have been maybe a month before the Osprey days. And I thought, oh yeah, that'll be great. Maybe next year we can do it. But somehow Myrna managed to get this organized, and it's been a wildly successful, you know, ever since then, every year. A lot of attendance, and it's sort of more and more people learn about and appreciate the presence of the nesting ospreys around the bay. And then there was some articles in the local newspapers. I think it was in 2014, and then in 2018 there was a big article in Bay Nature that if you look back through their archives, you could read this one. It was actually had pretty good coverage of the whole development of the this expanding osprey nesting population. So a lot of people are pretty excited, have a really positive feeling about it, but there's continue to be threats to ospreys and their nests. So so there's threats to individual ospreys, and traditionally this persecution, such as shooting, egg collections, millinery. I always get tongue-tied on that one. So this is less of a problem than it was in the past, although some Atlantic coast ospreys, either in migration or their wintering grounds, are known to be killed at aquaculture sites, that they're on these wintering grounds. But that's become less and less of a problem. But a big one around here, and I'm sure many other places, is entanglement in the various kind of materials. The worst thing are abandoned fishing gear, the monofilament, and this plastic twine that may be brought to the nest as nest material. And sort of in the Midwest agricultural areas, they use this polypropylene twine to wrap the hay bales, and so then they'll just cut that and leave it in the field, and the osprey it'll resemble vegetation that would be good nest material. So then both the adults and the young have gotten entangled quite a bit. There's sort of a campaign to try to make sure that material gets removed. And then also there's probably one example around here for sure in Alameda. The adult male got entangled in fishing gear. It had a hook and weights and so forth, and it ended up apparently dying. And then electrocution can be a problem, because the nests, osprey can build a very, very solid nest on any distribution pole that has particularly if it has two crossbars. But in 2014, one of the nestlings, it probably had already fledged, but was coming back to the nest and got electrocuted. And again, I'll mention something about that later too. So a lot of these problems can be solved with a little bit of conscientiousness. Then there's then threats to osprey nests. So this is another issue, even though they seem to be able to manage in developed areas and industrial areas, but many of the structures that they're built on are on these old derelict structures that have been abandoned. That's sort of why they became attractive, because they were no longer there wouldn't be disturbances there. But many of these are, not going to be standing for that much longer, because they'll either collapse or be dismantled to prevent accidents and so forth. So, and then of course shoreline development. There's this constant push to develop every inch of shoreline that hasn't already been protected. So a lot of the nests are on on land that's currently vacant, but it's actually slated for development. And then the other problem can be that the osprey nest can be removed. They actually can be legally removed before there are eggs or young in the nest. But ospreys, once they select a nest site, are very persistent. So it's really not very effective to just keep removing the nest material. So we're trying to educate land managers and agencies and municipalities that these problems where the osprey are nesting on a structure that may provide a conflict are very easy to mitigate, actually. So that it turns out that ospreys will very readily adopt artificial nest platforms that are placed somewhere near where the original site is, and particularly if you put sticks on it, look like an unoccupied osprey nest. And we've had many examples now of them jumping onto those. So the first one that I got involved with was at Point Melotti in Richmond, which is was another Navy facility. It was a fuel loading depot. And so in the cleanup efforts, there's a big area where there's been this osprey nest on a non-active power pole for about 5 years before that, but it was right in the middle of the mitigation area where the ground had to be excavated pretty deep to get rid of it. So the contractors decided to cover up the nest. They put these deterrence contraptions on there that look like antenna. Here you can see there's two ospreys, one perched on the deterrence device, but these did seem to actually be effective. So the ospreys started trying other structures to build their nest, other poles, and then they would add the deterrence device to that. Eventually, they started building a nest on a live power pole by the city buildings. So finally, that gave enough motivation. We were able to convince the city and the contractors to allow us to put an artificial nest structure up somewhere near. This is actually not that close because it was a pretty big area being excavated. But so with the help of the City of Richmond Electrical Department, this is Mario Machado here, was the worker that helped me, or it's more like the reverse. But anyway, we provided the bucket lift truck here, and there was a pole, so we didn't have to have a new pole erected. There were already a number of poles outside of the area. Put this platform here on the top. This was actually larger than what you normally use. This one was designed for. We actually was donated by PG&E. They didn't have any of the Osprey tubs that they used. This was would be used for bald eagles. But anyway, so that was in March. The very next day, they were starting to add more sticks to the tub, copulating there and so forth. And by June, they had successfully fledged 3 young. So this is, one of now numerous examples where this sort of approach has worked. And so fortunately, well, here's one example. This is PG&E again. They actually have to deal with a lot of nesting osprey throughout the state, and I understand they maybe have upwards of 1,000, certainly hundreds of poles that they've modified to accommodate osprey nesting, because then it'll prevent the shortage. So this was at the Conoco facility in Crockett along the shoreline. The ospreys had built a nest. This one didn't have 2 crossbars, but they built it across the crossbar and these wires. And then you can see that at some point, probably when they had eggs or young, the nest collapsed. But it caused a short and an outage that they had to deal with. So anyway, so PG&E put this tub up, and the very next year, the osprey, when they returned from migration, they hopped right on this nest and added sticks and have been using it successfully ever since. And then Chevron's Long Wharf, there was an osprey pair trying to nest out by the power structures, equipment there, that you can see there'd be an obvious catastrophe if they caused a fire at the oil loading pier. So they actually took the enlightened step of putting a nest platform up there, and then the ospreys again took to it right away, and they've been nesting there ever since. This is so most cases where you're going to want to put these platforms up, it's where osprey are already being seen to try to nest. This one was actually this was organized by Shirley Dole at the Richmond Yacht Club in 2015 to put a nest platform up there, and there was just sort of on spec, but there are a lot of ospreys. We've been seeing a lot of ospreys flying around the area, looking for nest sites and trying to bump off pairs that are already nesting. So, in fact, the very next year, this nest was occupied, and it's been active ever since. And this one's really great because we can see it out our front window, and sort of provide so we can really monitor it pretty frequently, which is kind of nice to have these reference nest sites to keep track of the timing. And let's see this. Okay, this is at Mare Island. This is at the north end of the island near the Highway 37 overpass, and the ospreys in 2014, I think, nested on this pole here. And in fact, one of the young was electrocuted. I don't know if there was a short, an outage happened as a result, but they often do. Sometimes they'll cause a fire on the pole. So to their credit, Mare Island Energy was amenable to adding they put a new pole and built this kind of impressive wagon wheel structure here. And so and again, this pair, and probably many of you have seen this from that end of the island. So that osprey pair has been active there since 2015 now. We're on the new pole. And let's see, that's a close-up. This is from yesterday. There are 3 nestlings there, and you can see it's developed into a quite sturdy nest structure, and it's a very sturdy support. So this one should last for many years. But they don't have to always be so elaborate. This was again on the Chevron facility on the San Pablo Peninsula. The osprey were nesting on this pole up here, and I can't remember, it was maybe 2015. And then I was a little concerned what's going to happen here, and then I kind of waited too long to contact Chevron about it. And then so they're already nesting the next year, and I didn't notice right away, but actually they had already on their own basically put new crossbars below that and moved the wires down to there, and then just left the original crossbar. So this is again a nest that's been in use for over 5 years. And as I said, they really don't have to be that elaborate, judging from this example. So this was a situation in Mare Island again, where Evan Torres, the foreman at XKT there, ospreys have been trying to nest on their cranes, their active cranes in their yard. He took it upon himself to put this box, rather small box, on a pole that was already there, and the ospreys moved directly to that. And they've nested there for several years, but there was some road construction reworking going on there, so they've been a tub was put up nearby. It was used last year, not successfully, and not occupied this year. I'm not sure what's going on there, but they also put another one of these boxes, a little bit bigger box, on their other yard, where osprey have been trying to nest on various cranes in the area. And they occupied that nest last year, and they are active again this year. They have 2 young, probably be fledging before too long. So this is shows you the different types of structures that have been used, are now being used by the ospreys that have been active. So the orange bars, that's this year. The blue bars are the 2013, so when we first got started on this. So you can see there's been a real shift. So there's still, light structures are still a very popular nest structure, but amazingly there were 0 nest platforms in 2013, and there are 12 of the active nests are nest platforms this year. So at least we have more good examples, when we encounter situations where there's a potential conflict, and the land manager, it might be easier to convince them, and particularly since PG&E and Chevron are putting up many of these nest platforms, so they're probably kind of pay more attention to what they do than what we might suggest to them. And then these transmission towers, so in some other locales, these are actually very common nest structures. So, and then also on marine structures. So it's sort of interesting to see changes in this choice for nest sites. And I think these ospreys really pay attention to other members of their species when they're trying to identify a potential nest site. So there may be this sort of almost cultural change in nest site selection for ospreys, that hopefully they're so versatile in what they can build on. So maybe they will still continue to be able to expand even without so much of our accommodation. So I think that's ran there. Just the oh no, I'm sorry, I forgot about this thing. So in 2017, mainly organized by Cindy Margulis, there was a nest cam put on this crane at the Port of Richmond, and it's been become very popular, particularly during the pandemic and shelter in place, to watch the goings on at the nest. So this is in early nesting season when just the male is around, and then eventually the female will return. This male has overwinters, so it actually can be seen around the area throughout the winter. And then usually about the beginning of March, the female shows up, and they've been named Richmond and Rosie. And then, so now you can see these goings on in the nest that are just impossible without a nest cam available. So here's a case where you have the young that's hatched. There's still an unhatched eggs there, so you can really see things right from the beginning. And then here's after they've grown to close to fledgling size. So this is really enabled us to see a lot more detail about what's going on, at least in this nest, and also kind of helps you interpret what you might be observing at other nests when you can't actually see into the nest. One thing that's been very interesting to utilize it for is to look at the distribution of fish species that are delivered to the nest. So this is Craig Griffith, who was one of the viewers and sort of has taken on the kind of daunting task to compile all these, because this is the pie chart of the species that were brought to the nest last year. So that was 723 fish between March and August. The bulk of them, like over 85%, are jack smelt and striped bass, but there's quite a diversity of species that are also brought there. One that turned out to be very interesting that I didn't know about before is the plain-fin midshipman. I'm not going to go into biology of it, but I encourage you to look this up and read about the biology and kind of interesting history with the houseboat community at Sausalito in the 1980s. And then, so anyway, so that's actually turns out to be, was a big surprise, the third most common, than the starry flounder. And sort of interesting development this year is, so last year there was one, probably a steelhead that brought to the nest, one salmonid. Recently, the male has been bringing in one after the other salmonids, which we think may be most or all Chinook salmon. Brought in over 20 in the last week. So anyway, this is sort of a very interesting utilization of the having this nest cam available. We also have people watching it like 24 hours a day to report events, and we actually have all the videos recorded, so we can go back and look at the details of interesting events that occur on the nest. So then the other thing that we've been very interested in is where do the ospreys that do migrate? Probably 90% of the ospreys in our area migrate south, maybe in September, October. We don't have any specific information on our population. So if you look in the Atlantic coast, many ospreys have been tracked using the satellite GPS transmitters. And so most of them go down down the Atlantic coast. They have to do this big water crossing actually to get into South America, and this is kind of a hazardous spot. Even a couple years ago, there was one that was tracked from Nova Scotia. You're showing this line, so it didn't get over to the coast, so it flew 2,000 miles over sea to eventually come to shore, and unfortunately, it arrived there just in North Carolina when the hurricane hit, and it died, unfortunately. Ones in the Midwest can join that Atlantic flyway or the Central flyway. And so there have been some, not a big number, but a number of ospreys from British Columbia and Washington, Oregon that have been tracked. And almost all of those go to southern Mexico and Central America with just a couple exceptions. Here's more of a detail of that. So these are showing the paired wintering and nesting locations of those ospreys that have been tracked. So the bulk of them go down to the southern Mexico and Central America. So we sort of expect that's where ours are going to go, but we really don't know for sure. Anyway, as a result, we've been banding the nestlings at that nest since 2017. This has been effort led by Teresa Ellie, who is the banding manager of the Golden Gate Raptor Observatory. And so we have a bunch of several expert banders doing this. And so here's an example of the utility of this technique. So this is in June of 2017, just after we banded the young on that nest. There's this one, the code is ZR. And in 2019, one of that same young, now an adult, flew to the nest just enough to get into the camera view. And that's the only sighting so far. But anyway, we know that this one managed to find a wintering location and then return to the natal area, there's probably about a 50% success on that. Probably 50% of the young die in the first year, because they have, for various reasons, they may get off track on migration, end up out at sea, or they probably more likely they just aren't efficient enough at foraging to feed themselves. But anyway, this one, and it wasn't welcomed with open arms. This is the female, the parent. Once it becomes an adult, it's just considered just another interloper. I think some of the viewers were a little disappointed at that. And then I also should mention that ospreys do not return after their first winter after migrating. They actually spend 2 years on the wintering grounds before making their first migration back. So we have to wait 2 years for that. And then this year, we found another one in the area. So this is a male from 2018. VU is the code. And then in May, while we were doing a brown pelican roosting survey along with Ralph Pericoli, we spotted a osprey come to a piling with a fish, and lo and behold, it had this code VU. So that's at least our first successes as far as resighting these. What we're really hoping for are for sightings in Mexico or Central America during our winters there. So that'll start to give us that information. Eventually, we might hope to have some transmitters installed as well. That's a bit of a bigger, longer term project at this point. So I think that's where I'll stop there. This is this quote from Roger Torrey Peterson, who he actually watched the ospreys go from very abundant in New England into the DDT area where they just got decimated, and then saw the recovery. So this is conclusion he came to from watching that whole long scale process. So hopefully we can also give them a chance to get established, remain established here. Okay, so I guess I was going to do one more thing that I just, let's see, how do I do this? Okay. Just a quick view of the nest cam, just so you have an idea what sort of things you can see. Okay, so right now, this is actually, I'm just showing what's viewing on the nest cam now. There are two of the juveniles at the nest. They've all begun flying, but they will continue to return to the nest to get fed or to maybe roost at night. Gradually, they'll spend less and less time there for maybe until through August, as late as August, and then they'll just disappear, presumably to the south. And then I also want to point out on this, so this is this sfbayospreys.org. We've recently upgraded the website. This fact page has, if you go up here to the top, has a lot more useful information. Information that's about ospreys in general, but also the history with this nest and with the local population. And then down below, there's a lot of the same information I showed you. And then the fish, this is a lot of information that Craig has put together on the deliveries of fish in relation to the date and stage of the nesting season, tide, and then the species breakdown, time of day. So anyway, so that's just a little preview of what you can be able to see on sfbayospreys.org.
Thinking about why are the ospreys expanding their population, water quality was thought to be important. What are your current thoughts on that?
You know, we sort of tried to come up with reasons, but it's nothing is really. There was this change in optical. Well, the reduction in the sediment in the 1997-98 El Nino year apparently flushed out the last of the remaining material from the placer mining. But so that was one thing I had thought was maybe a possible reason, but it just doesn't quite, the timing doesn't quite work out for that. The fish population has been pretty much the same. You know, the water quality has improved, particularly in the South Bay, but the fish population hasn't increased. And I don't think the osprey have, since they only dive up to 3 feet below, I just be surprised if the water quality has changed so much that now they can find fish. And in fact, before that, the birds from Kent Lake came over to fish. So I think it's more about the nest sites. And maybe you had a few pioneering these structures at Mare Island, human-made structures. All the nests, I guess I should have mentioned, all the nests at Kent Lake are on trees, like more the historical nest sites. So I'm inclined to think it's more that they've figured out, so to speak, anthropomorphized, that they could use these structures that, you know, coincidentally, when the Mare Island shipyard was shut down and then the Navy shut down the fuel depot on San Pablo Peninsula, there became a lot of structures available where there was no activity. So
what's different about the feathers that they can actually dive in the water? Or do they have a different preening conditioning material that they use? They can dive in the water and just shake these.
I think there's one thing, they don't have these things called aftershafts down in the body feathers that allows them to squeeze the water out. Supposedly, I mean, that's the only thing I've read that's unique about their feathers. I mean, the anatomy of their wings, I think, must be different to allow them to push off the water with a fish that might weigh half of their body weight. You know, when other raptors, you know, just can't fly out of the water, you know, like some water birds can.
Something that's always boggled my mind is that osprey are like 2 million years old, right? They haven't changed for 2.3 million years.
Something like that, yeah.
How is that possible?
Because they're so specialized, I think. You know, that's like when they refer to something that's a living fossil. What that really means is like a very successful, you know, evolved to this very successful state. I'm sure the DNA's been evolving, you know, and so forth. So it probably just means they've and they're the only raptor that can hunt like this. So they have access to this prey that none of the other raptors have. Although bald eagles have it, they can sort of get, you know, they can grab them from the surface, or they can pirate them from ospreys, but they're really the only ones that can access the fish that they're able to access.
Thank you. I know that you're planning some DNA studies. What are you hoping to, what's the range of information you hope to get from the DNA studies?
Well, we're just going to be doing, I mean, we'll still have some of the samples left, but chances are we're only going to be able to confirm our sex assignments to the nestling at this point. You know, we'd have to, maybe next year we can collect samples that they can be used for some other purposes, I think. So, you know, we need somebody to take this on as a project, a graduate student, postdoc or something. So, you know, we just don't have the people that have the time and the expertise to do a lot of the studies that could be very interesting. I mean, unfortunately, it's been very nice to have DNA from the Kent Lake population before to see if, you know, if you could actually determine that it was the expansion of those in particular. But that's a huge project that I don't think is ever going to be done for our population.
Thank you.
Okay.
We've been watching peregrine falcons, and I finally asked, well, how do they kill their prey? So what do the osprey, how do they kill the fish?
Well, let's watch the nest cam. They do it by eating them.
Oh.
They will, you know, eventually usually the male will start eating from the head. And when it's feeding the mate and the young, he'll eat some of the front of the fish and then provide the rest of the other ones. So it's probably, you know, they get to the brain. They still may wiggle around even after they're not really still alive, but yeah, they don't have the capability to, you know, snap the spine or anything like that.
I think, you know, the name of raptors, it means like to seize or to grasp.
Yeah.
And those talons actually do cause like internal injury. And that's probably contributes, like all the raptors, you know, they have to kill their prey. So that sort of injury also lends, you know, what could you call it? The coup de grace.
But some of them can kill them very quickly, kill their prey very quickly just by the impact and the grasping of the vertebrae, and presume snapping that. It just doesn't seem to happen with the fish.
I just have a little story. I lived in near downtown Los Angeles before I came up here. And we used to go for our nature walks over to the LA River. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yes, oh yeah, grew up in Southern California.
You know, they've let some water run in, plants, and it really amazed me, all the different variety of birds in the one little stretch where we would walk. And there was this big bird. He looked like, you know, a predator, you know. I saw him catch fish. I saw him take baths in the river and all that. And I had no idea what he was. And then I moved here to Mare Island, and there I found out about.
What year was that?
Well, I moved here in I think 2012, something like that.
Oh, okay, yeah. So there's a now a population in Orange County. There's several nests like in Irvine and Newport Beach, and I think there's one. So that's pretty close to there actually. So there'd also be wintering osprey there as well. So it sort of depends on the time of year.
So I want to thank you. I've actually never seen your presentation, Tony, because I've been serving fish tacos or something like that throughout all your years of giving the presentation. Same thing with the Flyway Festival. I've never seen one presentation except for the one I gave the first year on the Carquinez Strait. So thank you so much.